Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we're fortunate to have with us this morning to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Attorney Michael McDonald. And of course, Attorney McDonald, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
And to tell you how glad we are to have you here, because now you're no stranger to our audience this morning. We've had you on before, but now on a number of occasions, we might add. But what I'd like to do this morning, Attorney McDonald, is to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, recognizing that this year, 2005, represents the 50th anniversary of that Voting Rights Act of 1965. And earlier we did a series of shows dealing with the Brown versus the Board of Education decision of 1954. And of course, you know that 2004 represented the 50th anniversary of the Brown decision. And so we feel that we've dealt with two very, very significant decisions and very, very significant developments in African-American life as well as in the life of this country. And what we'd like to do today is to talk about voting in the United States. But before we get there, let's have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in terms of bringing you here this morning.
Well, good. Again, I'm delighted to be here again on the show. I was born in Buffalo, New York, educated and finished high school in Huntsville, Alabama, which is where my parents are originally from. I went to undergraduate school at Middle Tennessee State University, where I earned my associate's degree in law enforcement and a BS degree in political science, and also had the opportunity to be elected SGA president down there my senior year. And then I worked for legal services for a couple of years, went to graduate school at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale on a fellowship where I earned my master's in public administration. And then following graduate school, I earned a Thurgood Marshall fellowship through the CLEO program and went to law school at the John Marshall Law School in Chicago. Graduated from John Marshall, and then I was fortunate enough to relocate back here in the Middle Tennessee area and attended divinity school at Vanderbilt University, where I took ordination courses, and I was ordained as a United Methodist deacon in 2001. And in 1993, I was appointed Administrator of Elections for Nashville-Davidson County, which gave me the opportunity to work directly with voter registration and voting in the county, and to work through at least 3 presidential elections, and it was very exciting. And you're right, this is a very, very important topic that we're going to talk about today.
You know, I don't think, you know, just looking at your experiences, they've been almost exclusively devoted to some part of the democratic electoral process. And so let's talk about the participation of Africans in American history and the voting aspect of it over the next 2 or 3 minutes we have before we go into our first break.
Sure. First of all, when the Founding Fathers created the Constitution, it was done with little, if any, direction as far as providing for the right to vote of Negroes or women or even white males who did not own property. The Constitution gave the right to vote to only those individuals that were white males who owned property. And so it was only after a series of constitutional amendments that we saw the right to vote being extended to blacks and to women. For example, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was passed in 1870, gave blacks the right to vote and basically said that the right to vote will not be abridged by any state or city or county government. And then the similar right was extended to women in 1964 through the 24th Amendment. We also know that there was a period of time when even 18-year-olds could be registered, they could be drafted into the military, but they were not able to vote. And so the Constitution was again amended to change the voting age from 21 to 18. But we have seen over the past century major changes in the laws regarding voting for Negroes. One area that's critical is that many people think that it really was the 15th Amendment that gave great power to blacks to vote. It did, but many of the southern states put in place restrictions which abridged that right to vote. For example, there was something that was called grandfather clauses, which basically said if your grandfather in 1860 was eligible to vote, then you would be exempt from taking the literacy exam, literacy test, which was required for people to take and pass. Of course, in 1860, blacks were not eligible to vote, and therefore the grandfather clause didn't benefit them, it did benefit whites.
Okay, very good. And of course, let us have this first commercial break.
Okay.
Attorney McDonald, we'll be back to discuss this further. And we'll be back with you following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we have to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Attorney Michael McDonald. And of course, Attorney McDonald, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to continue our discussion in reference to the suffrage or the vote in early America. Go on, let's continue from there.
Well, before the break we were talking about the 4 areas, basically was 4 procedures or 4 tools that were used to prevent or to limit the rights of Negroes or African Americans to vote. The first I mentioned was this grandfather exemption, which allowed for someone whose grandfather was eligible to vote in 1860 to continue to vote even after the passage of the 15th Amendment. Of course, Negroes were not eligible to vote in 1860, therefore that exemption didn't benefit them, and not too long after that the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. The second way in which the rights of Negroes have been abridged is through something we call the white primary, and white primaries were held in the South primarily by Southern Democrats, Dixiecrats, who basically would hold elections, primaries involving the major candidates and exempt Negroes from participating in the primary. So by the time they got to the general election in which they could vote, the process was already completed. The individual who was going to ultimately win was picked during the primary election.
This is why it's called a white primary.
Right. And so this was also found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and states were required to remove those primaries. The third type of restriction was something we call poll tax. And a poll tax was simply, it was a fee levied in order for someone to vote. And what's strange about poll taxes was that in the South, those taxes became available during a period of time when sharecroppers had the least amount of money. So strangely enough, if you couldn't afford to pay the poll tax, you couldn't vote. And then the fourth type of restriction is something we know as a literacy test. And this is probably the one that most people are more familiar with, where you literally had to take an examination in order to even register to vote. And usually some of the questions related to understanding the U.S. Constitution or state constitution. There are even some questions just as outrageous as asking the applicant how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap, and some situations where in the voter registration offices there would be a fishbowl full of marbles, and the applicant would be asked to define the actual number of marbles in the fishbowl. These were the types of gimmicks and obstacles that Negroes faced. And prior to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there were fewer than 70 black elected officials in the United States. Following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the number shot up to 2,080. And right now we have over 9,000 elected officials that are African American descent, and many people attribute that to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, of course, the act wasn't passed without much upheaval and a lot of resistance. There were 4 incidents, or actually occurrences, that I think played a major role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The first was something we call Bloody Sunday, and that represented the march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, where blacks who were going to march to Montgomery to basically confront then Governor George Wallace about the obstacles that many blacks faced. Again, it was a situation where literacy tests were still being administered. and Governor Wallace had actually mobilized the Alabama state troopers to prohibit these voters from crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And many of these individuals were beaten and critically injured, and so it became known as Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday. And it gained coverage from around the world. The second incident involved the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, who were killed by members of the Klan, and also with some collusion or conspiracy activity on the part of the Nebotia County, Mississippi Sheriff's Department. And so those 2 incidents, along with 2 other things, the third being Fannie Lou Hamer, who was from Mississippi, who was a part of the integrated Mississippi delegation to the 1964 Democratic Convention that wanted to be seated, but there was an all-white Democratic delegation from Mississippi. And as you know, that incident itself marked a major impact on the Voting Rights Act. And then the fourth element, of course, was the role of President Lyndon Johnson, who became a major champion for civil rights at the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1965, and then eventually the Housing Act of 1968. President Johnson, because of his finesse and his ability to having worked in Congress, his ability to work with the Southern Democrats, was instrumental in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So those 4 elements really played a major role in the passage of the act.
You know, we've got a couple of minutes before our second commercial break here, but let's raise this question. We know that Johnson became the president following the assassination of President Kennedy. Yes. And this, certainly you can't say what would have happened had not certain things happened, but do you think that all of this activity in reference to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the Voting Rights Act, and all of those activities that Johnson, as the president, put all of his weight and all of his influence behind, do you think that that could have become a reality under President Kennedy?
Again, we don't have the ability to rewrite history, but I do not think we would have had these acts passed with the expediency and with the sense of urgency that they did pass under President Johnson, who again had an understanding about just Southern politics. And I just think, just as a political scientist, you cannot overlook that one fact.
Yeah, well, that's what we found in American history, that Johnson played a very significant role in reference to integration, in reference to civil rights, and et cetera. But yet we find that he rarely receives the credit that he is due in reference to that. And I think, and that's why we raise that question now, that perhaps we can give him some credit, because I think that he played a very significant role in all of those things that we talked about. But this is essentially what we want to do. Now, when we come back after this, the end of this segment, we want to talk about the impact that this act is having and what we can do today in order to make this act a reality. We'll be back with our audience following this very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to this final segment of the show for today. The topic is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we're talking to attorney Michael McDonald. Of course, Attorney McDonald, before we had our second commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to continue this excellent discussion dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think one of the issues that we left off with had to do with the role that President Lyndon Johnson played in that, not only in that event, but the role that he played in several other very important acts. Let's continue our discussion from that perspective.
Okay. Well, the other thing I guess would be relevant to discuss regarding the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the fact that it has been extended. The act passed in 1965, was extended again in 1970, was extended again in 1975, and extended the third time in 1982. And each of those 3 extensions represented the intent of the Congress and the President at the time of each of the extensions to broaden the power and the authority of the national government over some area involving voting. Everything from extending protection to Hispanic, Latino Americans, to making sure that there wasn't what we call gerrymandering, which is where you have a political districts that are carved out to benefit a particular officer or an incumbent or particular group. That the act was extended to address those type issues. The act is also up for extension again in 2007, and in 2003 and 2004 there was an email that got a lot of circulation that basically represented that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if it wasn't extended in 2007, would take away the rights of blacks to vote. That is not true.
Speak to that, because I think that is one of the real issues that we hear addressed during this, when you talk about the extension. Speak to that.
Sure. Again, the email and the information as far as the act not being, if it's not extended, would abridge the rights of Negroes to vote is not correct. First of all, the Congress has been consistent in terms of its commitment to extending the act. It's been a bipartisan commitment over 40, 45, 50 years. Second, even if the act were not extended, the rights that blacks have to vote is protected through the Constitution, through the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment. The purpose of the act, the Voting Rights Act, was basically to give the Congress and the federal government the authority to come in and to basically put teeth into the 15th Amendment. And then third and finally, most states have within their state constitution some amendment which protects the rights of blacks to vote. So even if there were changes made at the congressional level, blacks, along with other Americans who have dual citizenship as national citizens of the federal government, and then the second citizenship within the state that they reside, would still have protection. So I think it's important for us to make sure that people understand that even if the act is not extended, the rights of blacks would still be protected by the 15th Amendment.
You know, one of the real issues dealing with the suffrage here in the state of Tennessee, since we're dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, has to do with the state having taken the right to vote from convicted felons. And as a matter of fact, I think that was in the newspaper quite recently. And people let's speak to that, because I think that too is a part of this Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the sense that these individuals are denied suffrage. Talk about that.
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, most state constitutions address voting, and under the 10th Amendment under the federal constitution basically says that all rights that are not given to the national government are reserved to the states. Well, one of the rights that's reserved to the states is voting. And so states have, to some degree, the right to regulate and decide who can, in fact, vote. Most states do have prohibitions, or have, not prohibitions, but basically restrictions against individuals who have been convicted of certain felonies. And as we know, black males are overrepresented in terms of convictions for misdemeanors and more serious felonies. They make up somewhere between 65 and 68% of the adult male prison population in state prisons and also federal prisons. And so the impact that these laws have on African American males is disparate, it's disproportionate when compared to the impact that it might have on other groups. There are several different organizations, the NAACP, the ACLU, several organizations, and some moderately conservative organizations who are taking a much closer look at this and saying, what relationship does a conviction of a felony have to someone's right to vote if they've already served their time, and the fact that they've gone through the judicial process. The judicial process has already rendered a penalty for them. Is this not a form of double jeopardy? Double jeopardy, where you're saying the person is being punished again. So there, for example, in the state of Alabama, I know that there was a project where they focused in on trying to restore the rights of those African American males who had been released from incarceration, either through the probation process or some other process, and helping these individuals to go through the process of having their rights restored. In Tennessee, we had a system where, depending upon the nature of the offense that you are convicted of, and when you committed it, you could be restricted from voting. And now, the way the law is written, that it pretty much covers just about any felony. And so, hopefully, the legislature will take a much closer look at this. But this is not something unique to Tennessee, something that exists in all 50 states.
Well, and so this is, and even though we're talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we're essentially saying that this is one of those areas that is as significant now as the discrimination against other groups at an earlier period, and it's something that simply limits our democracy. Would that be?
I think that's a fair and accurate assessment. And again, the issue that's raised by many legal scholars is this idea of a type of double jeopardy. And I think there's some merit to that argument. And maybe it will get to the point where there will be a test case brought before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will be able to
deal with that as an entire issue, not have to deal with the state by state.
State by state, which is what was avoided through the Brown decision. And what happened basically when we looked at the literacy test and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and white primaries, the Supreme Court, different Supreme Courts, the same United States Supreme Court, but different courts in different periods of time in history, from 1870 through 1964, went on record as saying those four different procedures clearly were unconstitutional and violated the due process rights of blacks.
You know, we've got about a minute and a half, Attorney McDonald, but before we end the show for today, let's have you to make some statements to perhaps some of the younger people of our generation who might not understand the significance and why their vote is important. Speak to that issue, why they ought to vote, register and vote.
Well, first of all, I think if they understand the history of the battles that were fought for blacks and women and people of color to vote, they would have a greater appreciation for its value. I think, as in so many other areas in American society, the suffrage, the right to vote, its value has been diminished. And to understand that in our democracy, in one of the strongest countries in the world, where you have the right to actually go on record and say who you want to provide leadership at different levels of government, locally, the state government and the federal government, that is a special opportunity. And the fact that we are able to vote and decide who's going to represent us, decisions that impact us. For young people, I think one of the critical issues would have to be possibility of bringing back selective service. And the idea that you have the right to actually speak to that and decide who's going to represent you in Congress, represent you in the United States Senate, and ultimately the presidency. And also helping them understand that all politics is local, and the things that happen locally that have a direct impact on them on a day-to-day basis.
Very good. And of course, Attorney McDonald, let me thank you over the last 8 or 10 minutes that we have here for bringing us that excellent information today dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and